Hello, y'all. Welcome back. It is day 2 of Unit 2, the biological unit. So, yesterday we spent talking about the nervous system and the neurons, which I said are kind of like our carrier pigeons that help us communicate between our brain and our body and our body and our brain. So, we ended yesterday by labeling the neuron and kind of identifying the different parts of the neuron that a message or a neural impulse must go through in the process of that kind of domino effect of sending that message throughout a neural pathway. So you did your little neuron dance, we did our little sheep activity, and now we're going to get into what I said is the really important stuff that happens in the axon, that kind of electrochemical reaction that makes it possible for the message to keep sending and keep that kind of domino effect going. So let's get into it, folks. All right. So again, just like I said, I think at least for me, my brain likes this. I think the domino analogy works well in that it's not one neuron that is like going through and like sending a message. It is neural pathways of like billions and billions of neurons in which a neural impulse or a message, right? Those are kind of the same things. Neural impulse or message are the same kind of synonyms. So a neural impulse slash message will go through a series of billions of these kind of domino effects of neurons in order to send a message. So that's kind of how my brain processes it. So, like I said, today we're talking about the electrochemical stuff that happens mainly in the axon that allows for the message to go from one neuron to the next and kind of continue that domino effect down a neural pathway until we get to the eventual place where you want that message to go. So this is kind of my like flow chart summary of what this process is. So now we're going to get into kind of each of these more in depth. So we'll end with this so we can kind of summarize what we're talking about. Okay, so let's get to it. Neuron, I said, is like a battery. So if you think about a battery just chilling by itself, it has the potential to release energy, but when it's not plugged into anything, it does nothing. It's just chilling there. So just like you talk about in like physics, right? Things have potential energy, right? Same idea here. A neuron is like a battery that's unplugged when it's at resting potential. It's just chilling at resting potential. It has the potential to, if activated, release energy. But at this moment in time, it's just chilling at resting potential, not actually releasing energy. So when a neuron is at resting potential, you'll see that the inside, remember, this is the axon here. It's covered by myelin sheath. So the inside of the axon is dominated by negative ions. But then the outside of the axon is dominated by positive ions. So we're going to see that once we switch things up and change it into a action potential, this is going to switch. So it's going to switch from negative to positive inside the neuron. All right. So again, resting potential is just when the neuron is chilling and it's not firing a neural impulse or doing that kind of electrochemical reaction that allows for that message to fire and send on and continue that domino effect spiraling. So when a neuron is at resting potential, like I said, it has an overall negative charge inside. And it's going to be chilling, you should know this number, at negative 70 millivolts. So we can see this here. I'm going to reference this chart throughout the video. So it's chilling right here. It is what you'd call polarized, meaning that it is negative, chilling at negative 70 millivolts. The inside of the neuron, like I said, is overall negative with mainly potassium ions. And then there's also more negative proteins that kind of result in it having an overall negative charge. But the outside, we said, is mainly positive. So there's positive sodium ions that are surrounding the axon outside of it. But again, this is the word polarized, which is a synonym for negative. So overall, negative charge, it's polarized inside the axon, but we have positive sodium ions surrounding it on the outside. And like I said, when it changes from resting to action potential, these ions are going to switch around, so it's no longer going to be negative or polarized. So right now, we're at resting potential. It's negative. We're getting ready. We could have an action potential, but not at this moment in time. It's just chilling at negative 70, having a grand old time. Okay, so now we're going to get into action potential. Like I said, this is where all the good stuff happens. So we need an action potential, or this kind of burst of energy, this jolt, to allow for the neural impulse or the message to proceed through the neuron and get passed on to the next neuron to continue that domino effect. So action potential is just that brief electrical charge that again goes zoom. Let's keep sending this message through the axon and through the rest of the neuron into the next one. And what causes the action potential to happen, this jolt of energy to push on the domino effect? What causes this is the change of the ions in and out of the neuron. So, like I said, at resting potential, inside the axon is dominantly negative. Now it's going to switch a root. So, what the outside was overall positive and the inside was overall negative, they're going to switch a root to make it so the inside now is positive and the outside has moved to more negative. And this is kind of this movement is what causes this jolt and burst of energy, which is the action potential. So like I said here, positive sodium ions that were once located surrounding on the outside of the axon, there's little gates now that during this action potential open up. So these sodium ions move in, causing the neuron to depolarize and become positive. So like I said, the word polarize means negative. So if it's depolarizing, right, it's moving closer to zero and less negative. So we're depolarizing away from negative 70, moving closer to zero. So let's go back to our picture here and we can see this happening. So once an action potential starts, right, we are at negative 70. We're going to depolarize, right? So we're getting closer and closer and closer, boom, to zero. We're depolarizing, becoming less negative because those positive sodium ions have now entered into the axon because the little kind of gates opened up. All right, so again, let's look at this picture a little closer, right? So we have little gates opening up. So these positive guys are flowing inside of the axon, making it overall a positive charge now, or at least moving towards that positive charge as more flow in. So again, that's what this word means. Depolarization is just moving away. So it's less negative as more positive sodium ions move into the axon. All right. So we see here something important happens at negative 55 millivolts, right? There's this whole dashed line through it. So we're going to see that this is called the all or none law. So as we're depolarizing, again, we're moving away from negative 70, becoming less negative, moving towards the positive. Something's going to happen at negative 55. The all or none law is the idea that a neuron either fires or it doesn't. All or none. So it has to hit negative, this action potential, this energy shift needs to hit at least negative 55 millivolts in order to fire and cause that little boom to actually create that jolt of energy to fire that neural impulse through to the next neuron and pass on that message. So if it does not hit negative 55, so maybe it goes, it's at negative 60 or negative 57, right? If it's just below that, sorry, too bad, so sad. It was not strong enough to hit that threshold and now fully release that action potential to carry the message on. It just won't pick it up. It won't read it. So, so bad. You have to hit negative 55 in order for it to register and read it and go boom, release that action potential. So the first thing again, neuron either fires or it doesn't, and it will only fire if it hits at least negative 55. But the second part of this is that once it does hit negative 55, it could be really strong. It could hit negative 55 and it could go all the way up to like positive 30. We don't care. It's always going to fire at the same intensity. So it doesn't matter if it's just barely, it just got to negative 55 or it ended up at 0 or ended up at 20, whatever. It doesn't matter how intense it is. It's not going to change how intense like the action potential or that little kind of burst that is occurring. It's always going to fire at the same intensity once it does register at negative 55. So kind of like an idea is like maybe you're like annoyed, you're waiting for your friend, you're like ringing their doorbell a bunch of times and you're like pushing it really hard, right? Like the harder you push the doorbell, it doesn't matter. Like as long as you push it enough that it registers, it's going to make the same sound that it would at the same volume if you like pushed it, like jammed your like finger on it and like pushed it really hard, right? So it's that same kind of idea. And another analogy that I'm going to use at the end to remember all these things is thinking of a neuron as a toilet. So, I mean, I don't know, toilets are all different, newfangled these days, but right, like typically you have to hit the little knob on the toilet hard enough that it'll actually flush. But again, you could hit it really hard. It doesn't matter. Like once you hit it hard enough that it flushes, it's not going to change the intensity of the flush, right? You just need to hit it and go boom enough that it registers. And if you're slamming it down, it's still going to flush with the same intensity, unless it's some crazy toilet, right? So you can remember it that way. So again, this is kind of this threshold is negative 55. That's why it's marked here. We got to hit that. And then once you hit that, boom, we're going to send that action potential, and that kind of charge is going to release at the same intensity each time. Okay. So now we did it. Huzzah. We made it to negative 55, and now we are cruising. We are, again, depolarizing more, and now we sent that message, right? The action potential happened. The jolt helped send that message now to keep that little domino effect going and moving it on to the next neuron. So now what we're going to see happens is, yay, we made it. We made it to the top, the peak here. And now repolarization is going to happen, right? Because if you know anything about just kind of human nature or science or whatever, is that we like to kind of have that balance, right? We like things to go back to homeostasis or that balanced state. So we've got to go back to our resting state now that we've done what we needed to do. So now repolarization is going to happen. So just like we said, depolarization is going away from negative. If something's polarized, it's negative. So repolarization is going back from this peak here where we're at like almost positive 30. We're going to go back towards the negative, back towards 0, back below 0, trying to get back to that negative 70 resting potential. So again, repolarization, if we look back at our nice picture here, is now it's all about these ions here. So like we said, at action potential, it's shifted. So it's a positive overall charge inside the axon. So now it's going to start shifting, right? Those gates are going to open up again. So the positive sodium ions are going to flow back out to the outside. And now we're going to try and regain that overall negative charge. So that's what this process looks like visually is. As more sodium ions leave and say goodbye, we're going to go down, 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 back towards negative 70. Depolarizing, going back towards negative. Or sorry, repolarizing, I should say. Well, okay. So now we've got something that happens called the absolute refractory period. So what actually happens is kind of like, I guess the neuron and this whole thing tries to return, like tries so hard to go back to repolarize and get back to negative 70 that it's like going so intensely that it actually goes a little bit below negative 70, right? So here you can kind of see it's almost at like negative 80 or something maybe, right? So we actually dip below our resting potential. And this is what's called the absolute refractory period. So we went really hardcore in repolarizing and going back down below -70, that now we need a break. And right, all this is happening kind of instantaneously, but you can think kind of in slow-mo. We're going to take a little break. And this is kind of like when your phone, like, so now that it exhausted itself, right? It went all the way back to even below resting potential. It's kind of like your phone died. And it's that moment where like your phone is in the charger, it's recharging, but you can't use it yet, right? You have to wait for the little like iPhone logo to pop back up and reload. So you can kind of think of it here. Like the phone's dead, but it's recharging in the charger, but it's that like minute or two that you have to wait for it to kind of get enough juice in order for it to turn back on and you can use it again. So this is what the refractory period is. So it's the time after an action potential where another action potential cannot begin. So it's like recharging during this time. It's below its resting potential in terms of like it's even lower negatively than -70. So it's the recharging phase where another action potential cannot happen. And again, this is happening in just a matter of seconds. But again, think of it as your phone's recharging, but it hasn't turned back on yet. So you can't shoot another action potential, but it's in the charger getting ready. And then in a couple seconds, you'll be able to do it all over again. All right, so those are all those terms. Like I said, polarized equals resting potential state of -70. So it means it's negative. Depolarization means you're moving away from the negative towards positive. This is where the action potential is happening. Repolarization happens once we finish our action potential and try to go back to our resting potential. So we're moving back towards the negative. And again, looking at how the ions are moving, we're moving away. So the negative ions are returning to the inside of the axon, and the positive ones are leaving and going to the outside. And one last term to note is hyperpolarization, which is what I showed us here, is what happens during the refractory period. So kind of refractory period and hyperpolarization are the same thing. Hyperpolarization is again when it goes below its resting potential during that refractory period. So hyperpolarization, right, it's hyperpolarized. It's like too negative. So it is too much where it's about -75 where it can't shoot that action potential. So there you go. So just to summarize, this is kind of the main idea. So right first, you've got your neuron chilling at resting potential -70. The inside of the axon is negative, the outside is positive. Now, we want to have that neural impulse or the message go fire to be sent on to the next neuron. So the action potential begins, we depolarize, you have the negative ions start to leave a little bit of the axon, and now the positive sodium ions enter to make the inside of the axon become positive. We gotta reach here for number 3, we gotta reach -55 threshold in order for the all or none rule to apply, in which at -55, now boom, you did it. We're gonna shoot off that action potential at that same intensity each time. So now once we're depolarizing still and we've done it, we shot our action potential. Now we're at the peak. We got to get back to normal, back to our resting potential. So we're going to repolarize and go back towards -70. So again, the inside of the axon now, we're going to have the positive ions leave. And then we're going to have the negative ones kind of return to their dominant form. So those sodium ones are going back to the outside of the axon, while the negative ones are now regaining as the overall charge of the inside of the axon. And again, hyperpolarization, that is the refractory period where we dipped too far below our resting potential. So now we're at -75. We cannot shoot another action potential because we got to recharge for a few seconds. But now we're going to go back, and we did it. And now rinse and repeat, right? This happens all the time continually as we're just living our lives. So now we're back to our polarized or negative resting potential state at negative 70. And that's that. And that is how you get that domino effect to happen, right? That's just happening in one neuron in order for that neural impulse or message to be sent and cross that, synapse to the next one and carry on and carry on. So just to go a little bit more in depth about synaptic transmission, which is that process of now the neural impulse or message has to cross the synapse, that little gap between two neurons that I said, right? Like I said, no dominoes are touching, right? They have a tiny little gap they got to get to when they're bopping and hit each other. So again, let's just review this a little more in depth from what I covered yesterday. Synaptic transmission, again, crossing the synapse to get to the next neuron. So like I said, no two neurons are touching each other. The tiny space between them is the synapse, also called the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. There's lots of names. But like we said, the electrical message or this neural impulse cannot jump. It needs crossing guards, which are chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. So for this, we're going to get all in depth into different types of neurotransmitters, but for the purpose of just actually like sending a message, we just need to know that neurotransmitters are contained in the terminal buttons and act as crossing guards to get through that synaptic little cleft or gap. Right. So again, you see this is your synapse here. You've got the terminal button here, which contains those neurotransmitters, like I said, the starburst in my example. You got to use them as your little crossing guard to get across here. And then they're going to take your message, go to the dendrites of the receiving neuron, so the next one in that domino effect. And they're kind of going to act as like lock and keys. So the lock is the dendrites of the new neuron, and the neurotransmitters hold the key to be like, boop, open up, we're here, to let that message continue on. But just like a crossing guard does not come with you to school and go out through your day, right? They go back to their post, right? So they help you cross the street and then go back to the other side. So that's what I call reuptake, in which they go back to their terminal buttons, the original spot. So again, neurotransmitters released into the synaptic cleft or the gap, attached to the receptors at the dendrites of the new neuron, act as that kind of key to open the lock, say, hey, here's our message. They stimulate the dendrites on the next neuron. And depending on what type of message it is, they either inhibit the next neuron to continue the message, or if it's like the message is done, they can excite the neuron to continue on the next message, or if the message is done, they can inhibit it to say like, you're done, domino effect's over, we're not sending on this message again. All right, so like I said, here's a little picture that kind of shows neurotransmitters help you cross the street, and then they have the key. So you can see here's some neurotransmitters, and you see they can kind of fit in to like the dendrites of the next neuron, right? This kind of is the key. This is the lock. They're going to fit in and allow that message to continue on. So it's what they call a key lock mechanism. But like I said, crossing guards don't go to school with you. So the neurotransmitters are going to go. They help you cross the street, say, do. Okay, lock, open up. Here's your message. Okay, bye, kids. Right? And then they're going to cross back to the original side of the street they were on, aka go back to the terminal buttons, which they were kept in. And this process in which they now helped you cross the street and they go back to their post, back to the terminal buttons that they originated in, is called reuptake. You can kind of think of it as like reuptake recycling, right? It's like you're not wasting these neurotransmitters. So when you guys threw your starburst on the ground, like you eventually picked them back up and we did it over again. Like you're not wasting it, you're recycling it and like reusing the same neurotransmitters each time. So that's reuptake. We're eco-friendly here in the neuron. And just like I said, some neurotransmitters are excitatory, meaning that they're telling the next neuron to fire the action potential. But if the message is done sending or something, they can also act as inhibitory neurotransmitters, which say, hey, you should not fire an action potential. We're kind of done with this message. Bye, right? So that's kind of the main gist of what we got here. Just an easy, right? I think when it comes to neurons, when it comes to brain parts, it's useful to have analogies because these are kind of abstract things. So the more analogies you can use, the better. So here's a helpful one for me is the neuron as a toilet analogy. So if you think about your toilet, it's a toilet has an action potential, right? Just like a battery is chilling when it's not attached to anything, it has the potential to have energy. But at this moment in time, when it's just sitting on a table, not attached to anything, it is just at resting potential chilling. So, same thing, toilet is chilling at resting potential. It has action potential when you actually flush it and initiate the impulse, right? So, the flush is like the impulse in this scenario. So, toilet, again, shows at resting potential. Once you flush it, you create that action potential and send that impulse of the flush down the sewer pipe. Just like a neuron, the toilet also has a refractory period, right? So we said refractory period is once you've sent that action potential, you had that impulse fire and jolt through, and now you're going back to normal, you have to have that recharging phase. So same thing, right? You guys have to wait. If you flush the toilet, you're going to have to wait a few seconds or a minute, depending on the type of toilet, before you can shoot another action potential or initiate another flush. You have to wait for the tank to refill. Again, right? You think, again, this idea that toilet is at resting potential because it has the water in the tank, it's ready to go, and is capable of being flushed. So once the water refills in that resting potential and gets back to resting potential, then again, you're good, you're ready to go. So you had your refractory period, it's recharging, refilling, and now it's back at resting potential and the tank is full and it's ready to go, initiate that action potential of the flush at any point in time. And like I said, toilets are also at that all or none idea, and that once you do meet that threshold of like the minimum amount of force needed to push down on the little handle to flush it, it's always going to flush at the same thing, right? Like you jamming it versus you just kind of pushing it isn't going to change how intense the type of flush is. So again, that's if you need that kind of analogy, that could be helpful. So that's what we got. And you'll be making your own little neurons and showing a little video of kind of this whole like movement of the ions, the firing of the message, where it grows, crossing the synapse, yada, yada, yada. But there you have it. I attached some helpful videos that at least help me understand it better. These are I think they're called 2-minute neuroscience. So there's a lot of really good ones if you need help understanding the neuron, understanding this whole neural impulse, electrochemical vibe. There's several of these 2-minute neuroscience that explain it very clearly for you that you can look at. All right. That's all. Have a nice